Hi, and welcome back to Continual. And it's time to pack up your crime scene kits and head to the scene. We're here with our experts to talk about how we go about conducting a crime scene investigation, gathering the evidence, and getting your story straight. I'm going to be your host, Jim Nettles. And before we dive too far in, let's find out who has come along for the ride. So, Jack, you're up first.
So I'm Jack Cullen. I'm the author of the Recollections of a Rue Night series, which is urban fantasy. It's about a police department in a magical city hidden in Massachusetts. The main character has the ability to make forged magic items, which he uses to fight crime. Prior to being an author, I'm an attorney, and I also have 25 years of law enforcement, where I achieved the rank of captain. I've worked patrol and investigations. At one point, I was the commanding officer of a unit that investigated special things.
John?
I'm John L. French, currently a full-time writer. I am a retired crime scene investigator, having done 40 years on the streets of Baltimore City. I write a variety of genre. My first love, it was and still is my crime and crime-related stories.
AJ?
I'm AJ Sherwood. I actually most of the time write fantasy, but I do have one psychic mystery series called John's Mysteries, which is why I delved into the whole criminal investigation. Before I was doing writing full time, I was a paralegal.
And Wayland?
I write under the name Wayland Smith, unless you really hate this presentation, and then my name is Jim Butcher. I have been a deputy sheriff for closing in on 21 years, and before that I was a private investigator for a while. My first novel that came out, In My Brother's Name, is about a terrorist hit on DC, so there's a lot of different crime scenes in that one.
So let's sort of start talking just the basics. What are some of the kinds of crime scenes you guys have investigated? What are the basics when you're walking into some sort of an incident? What are you starting with? So, Jack, I'll start with you on that question.
Well, soon paramedics are coming on, things more nearby. Obviously, you start the corner and you start to.
And Jack, you're fading out again.
All right, sorry about that. Once if it involves an injury, once the paramedics are gone, things along those lines, you want to set up a perimeter, crime scene tape, things like that, and you want to set up a crime scene wall.
John, what about you?
I've done just about every crime scene there is, from larcenies to sexual assaults to shootings to homicides, and have been involved in serial killer investigations. I've done just about everything except traffic accidents, and the only reason I didn't do that is Baltimore City has a separate traffic investigation.
AJ? So I know you're coming at it from more of the paralegal and that side of things, but what in your experience have you dealt with concerning kind of the basics of crime scenes or incidents, things like that?
So I do approach it a little bit different in my series because my guys are not first responders. They're not the first ones on the scene. So they're coming at it a little bit cold because they're having, crime scene photos and all the evidence presented to them so they can actually pick through the case. The few times I do actually have them on scene, I have them working with the detective on scene, so where they're not actually in the middle of it. They're trying to make sure that they're not stepping all over the place and messing with forensics, and they're letting people do their jobs. It's very rare that I actually have them actually on scene first. So it's kind of a different take on that. That said, I have been told recently that my crime scenes are too clean. And I was like, huh? I've got blood and body parts all over the place. What are you talking about? Too clean. And I learned something interesting from a Air Force special agent who currently walks into stuff all the time, which her investigations. And she was like, yeah, no, they're really messy most of the time. Like there should be a ton of crap that they're having to wade through, whether it's evidence or not. They don't know until they've parsed through all of it. And then she dropped this bomb on me of, by the way, a lot of criminals like to either pee or poop after they've killed the victim in the room before they leave. And I'm like, they do what? I'm sorry. One more time. I don't think I heard that right. She's like, yeah, that's common. I'm like, that's DNA that they're leaving behind. She's like, yeah, I know. Okay. Good. All right. So, if you're approaching it the way I approach it, make sure your crime scenes are messy. Just throwing that out there.
John, you look like you had a comment.
I occasionally you get the weirdos who defecate on a crime scene or leave other kinds of body fluid behind, but it's not a lot of criminals, and they don't do it on a regular basis. This Air Force officer must have some really, really weird people
Well, I mean,
committing
granted,
crimes in his area.
her experience is probably a little bit different because she's dealing with on-base crimes. And so she's dealing with kind of a different mentality altogether. But yeah, kind of throwing that into
I was a military police officer. I haven't really heard of that when I was in.
It's common with her for some reason, and she's been stationed in different places. So I don't, maybe it's just this generation. I don't know.
Wayland, how about you?
Crowd control, but not the way you think. If it's an interesting crime scene, everyone who's on is going to want to come take a look. And what you do to keep that from happening is you station someone at like the entrance to the scene or whatever with a clipboard, and you hold it out to them and you say, if you're going to go in, you have to sign your name here, and then I'm going to need a supplemental report from you. And telling your average officer that you need a report from them is like holding up a cross to a vampire, and they will suddenly think of someplace else they got to be.
Yeah. To add to that, it's kind of interesting when you're a patrolman and here comes a captain who wants to go on the crime scene, and you got to tell the captain that, and they don't want to hear it. But if you're doing your job right, you stick to your guns.
Yep.
This did not happen to me, but it happened to a friend of mine I was working with. He's on an outdoor crime scene, and there's the yellow evidence tape, and up walks then Chief of Patrol Bishop Robinson. That's his name, not his ecclesiastical title. And Chief Robinson does not have his ID on. And my friend, being like all of us, a smart-ass crime lab tech, said, "Excuse me, sir, but may I please have some ID? See some ID?" Robinson looks at him and goes, "Do you know who I am?" He says, "Sir, I know who I think you are. May I please have some ID? May I please see some ID?" And Robinson thinks for a minute and goes, "No, you're 100% right. Good job." He takes his ID card out. He pulls it on. He says, "Now can I go in?" He goes, "Yes, sir. Feel free."
Good for him.
Yeah.
So, John, I'm gonna start with you since you did a lot of crime scene investigation over a long career. As you show up on a scene, where do you start in the process?
Okay. You start now. We're not the first responders. By the time we get there, at least in theory, the patrol officers have secured the scene, and they may have started marking the evidence. And the first thing you do is you walk through the scene. You carefully walk through the scene, trying not to step on anything that hasn't already been stepped on. And then all you do is walk through the scene. You make mental notes as to where the possible evidence is. You try to define the extent of the scene. And then when you're done that, you consult the officer, or if there's a detective who showed up, you talk with them, find out what their interest is. And then you photograph everything, because you want to take pictures before you disturb the scene. And then you lay your markers down, because once you've laid your markers down, you have technically disturbed the crime scene. And you can no longer say, "This is the scene as I saw it." And then once you've got your markers down, you proceed to take pictures again. Once you've documented all the evidence or anything you think might be evidence, then if it's a shooting, if it's a homicide, something like that, you draw your crime scene diagram. I'm told by my colleague, the people I know who are still in the lab, that they're doing more and more three-dimensional scanning than they are drawing. And soon the whole drawing a crime scene diagram will be like the 8-track. People just don't have them anymore. They do three-dimensional scanning, And the BPD is actually has a couple crime scene techs who are certified drone pilots, and they're going to start, using drones for overhead scans. Only then do you collect the evidence. And you do this carefully, trying, with the goal of not contaminating anything. For instance, if something has to be swabbed for DNA and then dusted for fingerprints, you swab first and dust second. We have it's one of the main commandments of crime evidence collection. And that's something called the chain of custody. And this is where a lot of television and even authors get it wrong. Chain of custody is the record of what's happened to a piece of evidence once its evidentiary potential has been recognized on the crime scene to the time it's presented in court. There has to be documentation, written documentation. If in anywhere along the line the chain is broken, then a good defense attorney can and should attack the validity of the evidence, and by extension, attack the validity of all the evidence. We in the BPD were very, very, I'll use the word fierce about the chain of custody. Basic rule: if you picked it up, you get to submit it, and I don't care who you are or how close you are to the end of your shift on a changeover day. You will submit that evidence by picking it up. You've recovered it. In fact, if anybody but us started numbering evidence, we say, you name it, it's yours. So we were really strict about it. That's where a lot of TV shows, get it wrong. You'll see a detective pick something up and say, here, give this to the crime lab. No. And then once we recover the evidence, packaging it properly, which usually means no plastic bags, we submit it to evidence control, again, with all the proper paperwork and all that, everything properly sealed. And, and then it gets, then we're done with it. The crime scene investigator is usually done with it. We have, it can go to the latent print, go to the firearm, it can go to serology. But, my specialty was the collection and preservation of the evidence, not the analysis.
So AJ, in your research and in story, how do you approach, that idea of the crime scene?
I mean, I actually had to go through MurderCon to actually learn about the process of who's on scene first, because that's not information you can easily Google for whatever reason. And I've had specialists, through the years who've told me different things, like don't put evidence into plastic baggies. That was news to me because you see that on TV all the time. But if you do that in real life, it encourages mold and stuff to grow on the evidence. So you actually put it into paper envelopes. Yeah, that way you can actually document on it too. So I have to keep all that into mind when I'm starting to actually list the evidence of what are these guys looking at, who signed it out, who actually has to give it back. And a lot of the time I don't have the evidence leave the station. Like, they might move it over to a conference room in order to look at it or what have you, and then it goes immediately back, because that's real life. You don't take stuff out. You have to be aware of where everything is. Speaking as just someone who worked in a law firm, you would not believe sometimes how things just disappeared. And it used to drive me crazy. And it got to the point where if something disappeared and I couldn't find it, I went to the attorney's desk first because it was buried underneath stacks. And I'm sure a PD's desk was kind of the same because they were working on multiple cases at the same time. If they don't keep track of that evidence, it's probably buried on the stack of their desk at some point.
Well, talking about keeping track, there was a procedure, it was kind of informal, that if an officer signs, so first of all our evidence goes to one place. It's not like it's But if an officer like some evidence out for just to look at it or for investigation or something like that, and said, I'll bring it right back. Well, he left his ID or his driver's license with evidence control. And that way they were sure that yes, he would bring it back. He or she would bring it back. So but so
Yeah, you have to have that kind
very,
of
very strict, chain of custody.
Yeah, I actually have it in one of my books. Actually, I think it was the first book where I had someone who was trying to submit evidence because he was the one who collected it. And another detective who was working the case had left word with the evidence locker, do not accept evidence from this man. Like, this is my case. I don't want evidence from him. And he had to go to the captain to override that because he's like, it's evidence. I have to be able to submit it. But he kept track of it the whole time. He had it on his person. He did not try to leave it with anybody else.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing that you have to keep track of. Because believe me, the people who actually know the business, they will email you and correct you. They're very sweet about it, but they will correct you.
So Wayland, how about you? In your experience, when you're rolling up on a crime scene or something has happened, from your professional experience, how do you approach it? What are the first things you're doing? What are you getting into? Roll up.
Well, it depends on exactly what you're rolling up into. If it's an active scene, then there's either a crime has just been committed or is still going on, and you've got to contain the scene and stabilize everything before you bring in medics or crime scene or anything else. If you come up on someone and they're sort of standing there swaying on their feet, bleeding all over the place, yeah, they're putting evidence all over the place, but you need to treat the person first. You need to get the medics in there. And if there's an ongoing fight or hostile situation or whatever, you have to get that wrapped up before you can do anything else. After that, if all the immediate medical needs have been taken care of, suspects hopefully detained, or for a fact they're not on scene anymore, you've got to essentially freeze the scene. And unless in this day and age, unless you're specifically trained as a crime scene tech, you pretty much don't do anything else. You freeze the scene, you call it in, and you wait for the specialists to show up unless there's what they term exigent circumstance. Like if your crime scene is towards the lower end of a beach and the tide's coming in, yeah, you might need to move some stuff.
Right. Yeah.
But unless it's something like that, you freeze everything in place, maybe get a few pictures just for your own reference in case, but you wait for the specialists.
So how about you, Jack?
Yeah, basically everything they're saying. One of the other things you do is you look around for cameras, because nowadays there's cameras everywhere. So that way, detective comes on scene, you can say, hey, there's a camera on that green building, there's a camera over there in the bank. And that allows them, that saves them a couple extra steps. The other thing is you want to take patrol officers, you want them to canvass the area. That way we can, aside from the cameras, we can determine whether there's witnesses. Also, sometimes the crime scene doesn't end where you think it ends. That happens a lot with shootings, and it happens with traffic incidents. I remember one time your officers are pulling out with a traffic one, go to aid the person. Now it transitions into the traffic reconstruction stage, and one of the cruisers drove over a shoe. The guy nearly got knocked out of his shoes. He was very far from where the cruiser stopped, but the cruiser pulled up close enough to get out to aid him and didn't realize he hit him, ran over his shoe. That's happened. I know in other departments that's happened where they've actually run over shell casing because it was a running gun battle.
Yeah.
One of those ones. So you always want to check to make sure that the crime scene ends where you think it does.
And the big problem with shell casings is, of course, they're round and those things go everywhere.
They roll, yeah. I had an ambulance run over. The homicide was committed with a .22 caliber rifle, and the suspect had just left it in the street. And when the ambulance was responding to, hopefully aid the victim, it ran over the rifle.
Oh,
Oops.
I mean, the only damage done is that we couldn't, we had to eject the cartridges the old-fashioned way and not just take the clip out, But that was just one of those books things.
That kind of brings up another thing, is you have other agencies involved, involved.
Jack, losing you again.
Oh, sorry. Is that, yeah, I feel like I'm shouting. I gotta get a better audio. That brings up something about where sometimes you have non-law enforcement agencies involved in crime scenes, EMT, fire, things along those lines. They don't necessarily think in a preserving the evidence mindset. They're all about their lane. And I know of one incident where officers rolled up. There was that particular fire that wasn't the city I work in. That fire department had just gotten this whole training on decontaminating a scene, because I guess they were leaving and there was blood everywhere on the medical. So people were complaining. So the town basically came down with, you have to decon the scene before you leave. So officers roll up, there's a stabbing victim, there's EMT working a stabbing victim, and the fire department's going around squirting everything with a bottle of ammonia, some cleaning solution. The cop about lost his mind. What are you doing? I'm cleaning everything up. It's my crime scene. So they don't.
Yeah, that's, it's very important to get with like the fire department and all everybody else who might be, so that our paramedics and our fire department were very good as far as preserving evidence. I mean, yeah, they did what they had to treat the victim, but after that, they were very careful to like place the clothing where we could get it and all that. I actually gave a talk to the fire department dive team about recovering evidence that might be found like under the water or something like that. Oh, they were a great audience. Let me slide down the ball. So I mean, we always our fire department. I can't say that our fire department or with the paramedics ever ruined a crime scene unless they absolutely had to save a life.
Try looking for small pieces of evidence after someone's used a fire extinguisher.
Yeah, that's fun.
Oh.
So let me kind of throw this out there as an open question from you guys' perspectives, because I think you're calling it out here, right? It's not just even within law enforcement that's showing up and within the specialties of everybody that shows up to go through and carry through process and procedure. There's potentially a lot of different entities coming out, police, fire, rescue, ambulance, medical teams, whatnot. But also you may wind up with other parties out there as well. So who all do you usually wind up having to interact with in a crime scene when it's still there and fresh?
My interaction was largely with the first responding patrol officers, detectives, if it was a kind of case that you would call the detectives in on, and but on things like burglaries and holdups, my main interaction was with the victims. They were the ones who were, who discovered the crime. They're the ones who could tell you what was taken, or what the actions of the holdup person was, and so you had to be a little bit of, public relations and all that. And which is why I preferred homicides, to be honest. And on arson scenes, the officers were generally, I won't say useless, but they really couldn't help because their main job was to just secure the scene. I interacted mainly with the Fire Investigative Bureau, who along with our arson detectives, would tell me what they needed photographed and what they needed recovered, because frankly, I was not at my best on arsons. I was much better at on scenes where all the evidence hadn't burned up.
I work in the city of Alexandria, and depending on exactly where something happened here, you've got city property, we've got a couple of federal buildings, we've got a couple of metro stations, and Metro has their own police force. We've got military presence here. So depending on exactly what happened to where and who was involved, you've got no idea who's necessarily going to be showing up or going to the jail later wanting to talk to the suspect or witnesses. And I've never really seen one of those fights you see on TV about this is my jurisdiction. No, wait, it's mine. But sometimes you will get something more approaching just genuine confusion about who exactly.
Right. That's mostly it.
Depending on exactly where and what happened.
Actually, sometimes you'll even get like, well, this happened on the Harbor Tunnel Thruway, so it belongs to you, toll facility police. And the toll facility police goes, well, no, it's a serious crime. It's the BPDs.
Yeah.
Or even more fun, they find a body lying in the middle of the road, and homicide is trying to convince traffic investigation that it's a traffic accident, while traffic investigation is trying to convince homicide, no, this guy was murdered. And the crime lab's going, you guys work it out. I'm going to process the scene. You let me know who to send the report to.
Yeah, we have multi-jurisdictions in that area as well. We're not as big as Baltimore, so our officers actually, our patrolmen are fantastic. They do a lot of stuff that detectives are doing in bigger cities. So that way, when our detectives do get there, it's more of a team effort. And the various agencies that we interact with, we have good rapport with them as well. A lot of the people that we deal with on crime scenes are like John said, the victims, but also sometimes it's landlords, store managers where we need to get video from them. The other thing is your evidence sometimes travels. So I used to run a unit that dealt with crimes against children, domestic things along those lines. So a lot of times I'd have to send one of my detectives to the hospital to pick up a scene kit. The ERs were fantastic with this, where they treat the victim, but they'd also preserve the clothing, they put them in the appropriate bags, they would set up a whole kit, especially if it was a sexual assault. By the time the detective gets there, the nurse, the doctor would have the kit ready, the detective would be able to take it, bring it right into evidence.
To you writers out there, Jack mentioned sexual assault. You writers out there, a lot of jurisdictions now have either sane nurses, sexual assault, nurse examiners, or safe nurses, sexual assault forensic examiners. These are registered nurses who are trained in the collection of evidence from sexual assault victims. Baltimore's Mercy Hospital was one of the first in the country to have it. It is, I don't want to be glib, but it's basically one-stop shopping where you only have one person dealing with the victim, collecting the evidence, asking the questions, rather than having a whole bunch of different people come. And it's a great success. So before you do any writing about this situation, see if the location you're writing about has a safe nurse or a sane nurse or something. Or you can even interject something. The detective comes in and says, I need to talk to the nurse. And the person, safe nurse? Why? Are we in some kind of danger? And then you get to explain what safe nurse is.
So let me ask a question, because this is one of those things that, again, when you're delving into fiction, it's an easy thing of, I'm going to highlight the couple of items I need. But in the real world, we started by talking about a lot of the time crime scenes are just messy, kind of like my office is at the moment. But if you're coming into a crime scene, how do you make a determination of what is meaningful evidence, or what needs to be collected, how it needs to be collected? How do you make that determination as to what needs to be captured and kept?
Okay. Generally, if you go onto certain kinds of crime scenes, you know what kind of evidence you're going to be looking for. The shooting scene, you're going to be looking for the gun, you're going to be looking for bullets, you're going to be looking for cartridge cases, and you're going to be looking for cartridges, which is not the same. Cartridges on bullets are two different things. And then you're going to be looking for things that might have been handled. If it's an outside scene, bottles, cups, anything that looks like it had been recently left. And then you're going to look for the strange, the stuff that clearly does not belong on the scene. And I think in my top 10 is buttocks enhancer. Found in the middle of my crime scene. And I'm sorry that case pled out because I really wanted to say the words buttocks enhancer in court. And then you just ask the detective and the officer what happened. And based on that, you recover things. And if there's any doubt, you just, photograph it, document it, and package it, and let the detective sort it out. When I was at the FBI Academy a long time ago, taking their crime scene course, excellent course by the way, we had to do mock crime scenes, and at the end, we had to give our report about what was recovered, et cetera, et cetera. And the instructor looked at me and says, "So, Mr. French, what do you think happened?" I don't know. That's why God made detectives. And everybody else laughed, and he didn't appreciate it. But like I said, I was and will always be a smart ass grandma. Nice thing about being civilian.
Wayland, Jack, anything else you wanted to add on to that side of things of what you guys are looking for or dealing with, how you approach it?
It comes down to the crime. Guy stabbed with a sword, you want the sword. Obviously, if it's a sexual assault, you want the victim's clothing, things along those lines. So it really comes down to the crime.
If it's a burglary with a smashed in window and you're like in the alley next to the place that was broken into and you find what looks like a fairly new hammer, that's probably a good piece of evidence.
Yep.
Like he said, what doesn't belong there or what looks like it's particularly relevant to whatever event actually happened. We had a great one a little while ago when I was working the booking counter where a guy broke into a clothing store with someone watching him, came out of the store wearing a coat with the security tag still on it, and the witness followed him down the street on the phone with the police until they could take him into custody. And he was insisting that he hadn't taken it, even though the coat with the tag on it is what he's wearing as he's staggering along down the street.
It's no fun when they jump in the boat like that. Is
We've had people commit crimes while they were on ankle bracelets.
Yep.
Keep us employed.
And these days, as stupid as it sounds, it does happen. If you want to play with the idea of it, if you've got a suspect in your book, check their social media. You would not believe what some of these geniuses post.
Oh no, I believe it. I will add on too that it kind of depends upon the crime scene. I've heard many crime scene tech tell me that they love crimes that happen in cars because the crime scene's contained.
Oh yeah. Cars are one big. The outside of a car is one big suitable surface, and I'll tell you, white is a great surface for getting prints. So is that bright red color that they put in cars. You can basically show the car. Hold your brush up in front of a bright red car, and you can just watch the prints appear. That's how easy it is. And you've got fingerprints, you've got DNA. If it's a traffic accident, which we hit and run, you've got that kind of evidence. And there is nothing when you're having a bad day. There is nothing like ripping a car apart trying to find bullets to right up.
Yeah. The other thing with cars is you can move them. You can move them to a secure location, and you can take your time.
Mm-hmm. I listened to a lecture once by a forensic geologist, and that was actually really interesting. And one of the things that she mentioned was that she loves cars because she can scrape underneath the wheel well and go layer by layer and have an idea of how far the car has traveled, where it's gone.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, it was a very interesting course. She actually has a book that she put out that she suggested, which I have. But yeah, it was eye-opening because she was actually able to track, I think it was a custody case. This guy had taken a little girl and he'd crossed 8 state lines in the car. And because he'd gone west doing it, she was able to keep track of how far he'd actually gone and keep the chain of evidence preserved because of it.
That's really cool.
Oh, and before I forget, speaking of chain of custody, speaking of evidence procedures, in the chat, I posted a link to the FBI handbook on evidence, the Amazon page. 99.
Yep. You can pull that out or include that in the drop. So let's start talking a little bit about taking and using this information in fiction. Because I'm going to start with when you see these things on TV, because we've already talked about a couple of things that are infinitely wrong, much like plastic bags and some of these things. So AJ, what's some of the other things that in your research and what you've talked about and things you've done, what are other things you see that are absolutely wrong, but we see them all the time?
So there's a whole concept of intellectual property rights that you have to kind of observe when you're collecting evidence. And yeah, someone brought up social media, and yeah, social media was one of the main things as a paralegal we looked through for our client's sake, mostly because we wanted to make sure that they hadn't said something stupid. Plot twist, they usually had. But one of the things you have to keep in mind too is that there are specific rules with detectives on what they can and cannot do with a phone. So they can't hack a phone like you see on NCIS all the time. That's not one of the things they're allowed to do. But if you have a person who can do the fingerprint scan and open the phone that way, that's allowed. If you have to get them to actually enter a passcode, there's different rules for that. So it's one of the things you have to kind of keep in mind, that there's different ways to handle any kind of social media or phones. And you guys will know better than me. I've not had to touch any of that so far because my psychic can't handle electronics. So I've been able to skirt around it.
That's good.
But yeah, it's one of the things I learned at the conference. That's the first thing that leaps to mind is they don't always handle technology correctly on the TV shows. Like they tend to do magic wavy hands on that kind of stuff.
Wayland?
I'll go the other route and go something really, really low tech. Even on shows that usually do a good job with procedure in general, glove discipline, they are horrible with. You do not handle evidence with your gloves and then go type on your computer with your gloves still on and then go shake somebody's hand. You're cross-contaminating everything that way.
Mm-hmm.
Handle a particular piece of evidence, you get it analyzed or into the machine or whatever you need to do with it, you take those gloves off and you throw them away. And I get that you don't want to see that on TV. It's not really thrilling, but you don't use the same gloves for a whole bunch of different stuff. It's a massive break in the evidence chain that John was talking about, and it's a great way to get your case damaged. But yeah, glove discipline, either they never ever use them or they use the same pair of gloves for everything, and both of those are equally wrong and annoying.
Jack?
Well, a couple things. One, the whole stick your finger in the drug, stick it in your mouth, and, spit it out and go, cocaine. No. The other one is sticking the pencil in the barrel of the gun. Don't, no, that you're contaminating it. You're destroying the evidence. You don't want to do that. I had one more, but now I can't remember what it was. The glove one. Oh yeah. Whenever on TV they show the autopsy and the guy doing the autopsy, he's eating a sandwich while he's doing it. Or you got a cop guarding a guard scene, eating his lunch. None of that's done. So, John was talking, obviously, John and Wayland, they have bigger agencies. The authors out there that are writing about smaller agencies, you want to look at something like, a lot of times, like, we hit a certain level, we do the stuff ourselves. When it gets to a certain point, like, okay, a car where a shooting took place, we bring in the state police crime people, then they do it. Things along those lines. Stuff gets sent to the crime lab, and then you wait. It's not done in 60 minutes, minus commercial.
No.
John?
Okay, one thing, and I've noticed that they do this on Law and Order a lot, both Law and Order, Criminal Intent, that sort of stuff, is the Miranda rights. My understanding, I'm a civilian CSI. I'm not a lawyer, But it's my understanding that unless you're going to question them, if you're just arresting them and taking them down and not arresting them, you don't really have to read them their rights. Only when you start questioning them with a view that they may have done something they should not have done, do you read them their rights. And once you, if you've been questioning them for 2-3 hours and they finally said, yeah, you got me, I did it. That's not the time to say, okay, you're under arrest, you have the right to remain silent. You should have said this already. You should have gotten it in writing. It's a misunderstanding of, they know the people who write this stuff know that the rights have to be read. They just don't know when they have to be read. The other thing is the same thing is search warrant. BPD is, if they have to go into a house for anything, they will usually get a warrant. If they have a car, they will get a warrant. They're very, very careful about warrants. At least they used to be when I was working. It seems like some of these TV shows, the detectives play fast and loose with warrant requirements, more so in the British mysteries my wife and I watch than American. We watch most British mysteries, American crimes unless it's old TV shows. But the warrant requirements. If you're going to write, find out what the warrant requirements are, particularly in your jurisdiction. And finally, not every jurisdiction, not every state has district attorneys. Virginia, I believe, have Commonwealth.
Yes, we do.
Maryland have states attorneys. And some places have state police, some people have highway patrol. So if you're going to be writing, make sure you call the prosecutors by their right name. Make sure you call the state police agency by the right name. And for God's sake, do not call the medical examiner a coroner. They really, really hate that.
Let me add on to this too, because I actually had to delve into this for one of my books. Not every police station has an ME. Like, not every station is large enough to support one. And sometimes it is the coroner that will be the one to respond. But, a lot of the times too, a coroner is a public position. They're voted into this, which is not something that a lot of people know. And sometimes they're the undertaker, like they're the funeral home director. Like, they don't have a lot of training in this. So they're good at collecting the body. That's about all they're good for. So if you do have a serious murder case in a small town, understand that your ME is probably not from the small town. He's probably from the big city over, and he's crazy busy. So that whole process is not going to be fast. Nothing about the law is fast.
So let's actually touch on this a little bit more, because I think this is one of the things that we've covered in around, especially law enforcement and the law a lot, is depending on where you're at, the jurisdiction you're in, the size of the town you're in, size of the department you're in, there's a lot of differences in how things are approached. So how much of an impact does that have on the idea of evidence and evidence gathering and evidence management on where you're at, what size department you're working with, and what number of departments you're working with? So for example, let's say you are a small town and you then bring in the state police or something like that. How does all of that work? And are there really major differences? We were just talking about the fact of having the FBI guide for evidence gathering and evidence handling. So there is a lot of training, there is a lot of consistency, but how do you handle those differences depending on where you're at? So Wayland?
From a realistic perspective or from a fictional perspective?
Let's actually touch a little bit on both, how the realistic works and what we see in fiction and how that can be important.
Well, with fiction, you can get away with pretty much anything you want as long as there's a reason for it. Like all the technical details we've been talking about. If your main character is one of these amateur detective types, there's nothing wrong with them getting it all wrong because they don't necessarily know any better, but you really need to address that sometime in the course of the story. Someone should be correcting them. in the real world, one of the things that can happen is if you have to bring in an outside agency or an outside expert because you don't have the resources for it, odds are really good you don't know the person coming in and they don't know you. And there's always that sort of initial getting to know each other, sizing each other up. Is there going to be an issue between these two people? And someone come in and they're great, everyone gets along, and everything's perfect, and that's wonderful. And sometimes you get someone coming in and either the outside agent or the person from the jurisdiction gets remarkably, I'll go with territorial, and creates a lot of friction that doesn't need to be there. So a lot of it comes down to personality, even though it shouldn't.
Jack?
Yeah, and also, it depends on what state you're in and the procedures. The state I work in, the state police are called. If there's a homicide, state police are called. If there's a sudden death, state police are called. Sometimes they'll come out, sometimes they won't. Basically, anytime there's an unattended death, officer calls the supervisor goes over, checks everything out, immediately generally makes 3 phone calls. 1 to the city detective, 2 to the ME's office, who will, 87-year-old guy, had stage, X cancer, was expected to live longer than 2 weeks. Okay, I wait. And the next step then, call the funeral home. ME's office doesn't even come out. The other thing is to call the state detective. Oh, yeah, okay, natural death, no problem, we're not going to come out. However, murder or suspicious, yep, we're on our way out. So now they're both coming out. The ME's office would take possession of the body. The state detective would work with the city detective in investigating it. I've never really seen, you hear about it. I've never really seen any issues where our detectives work with the state detectives all the time, so you get to know them, you develop a relationship. So it's, it's not, what do you do on my scene? It's like, hey, Bob, hey, Larry, and you go about your day. But I mean, it depends on the state. They all have different things. One of the other things is, you get a murder, our district attorney's office is called. They come out, they kind of work with us. They don't get in our way, but they're prepping their side of the aisle. And it's, it's all one big happy family. Most of the time. One of the things we haven't touched on regarding evidence is, where it's stored. Perfect example, state of Massachusetts had a pretty big scandal a couple of years ago where the state crime lab, one of the technicians was so overloaded with work, she just started making stuff up. And she would sign off, and she sent a bunch of people to prison that with fake evidence and overturned a bunch of stuff that had ripples through it. So now there's a policy. When I made captain, right out of the gate, my deputy said, hey, you got to go check. You got to go do a check of the evidence room. I'm like, what are you talking about? I'd gone up from, all the way up to captain without ever having to done it because only captains and deputy did it. But we would do, and we still do, or the department still does, periodic checks of the evidence room. Grab a series of random pieces of evidence, go down and with the supervisor of the evidence room, check to see that they're there, check to see the packages are undisturbed, things along those lines. And that kind of helps with the chain of evidence as well when you go to court. We've all seen the movies where it's like, they pull out the bag of cocaine and baby powder. What happened? Where'd it go? And that's the storyline. But there's steps in place these days to prevent that from happening.
One of the other things that can crop up that I just remembered about also, and it's a good hook for fiction writers if you want to go this route. Depending on the size of your jurisdiction, I've worked midnights almost my entire career. I work nights. I prefer it. And one of the things you'll hear constantly on the radio is someone calls for an evidence tech or a canine or whatever, and there's just none on duty because those positions are not necessarily 24-hour. And then you have to work out if this person's going to be called in, if something else is going to have to happen.
Fortunately, Baltimore's 24/7. They're crime scene people. The thing that we generally deal with, and it's all mostly amicable, are cross jurisdictional cases where a crime starts in Baltimore County and winds up in Baltimore City, or vice versa. and it's basically, who's going to handle what. We had one case, there was a murder in Baltimore County, elderly couple killed, and their car was stolen. The car was found in Baltimore City, and both Baltimore City Police and Baltimore County Police were watching it. The guy got into the car. When they went in to arrest him, he sped up, crashed into a tree, came out with a big 45. And, well, I guess you know what happened. So we had Baltimore County traffic, Baltimore City traffic, Baltimore County homicide, Baltimore City homicide, Baltimore County IAD, Baltimore City IAD, Baltimore City Crime Lab, Baltimore County Crime Lab. Well, Crime Lab, we got along great, one of their cameras broken. We just took a film out of ours, lent them our camera. They put, did that. And the big thing was a discussion of who's going to recover what evidence. And since the primary crime being investigated was a double murder in Baltimore County, County got the car, got the 45. We got the cartridge bullets in the cartridge cases from the crime scene. Baltimore County officers went into our firearm units where our firearms expert who got called in test fired their weapons, collected the cartridge case and bullets, and for our purposes. So it was very, very amicable, and everything was documented. That's usually the case. Sometimes the feds come in and they like to do everything. They're called in, it becomes their case, and they like to do everything if, whether they can or not. The only one exception was that Baltimore City Crime Lab processes, at least they used to, all bank holdups, because we're better trained in it than the FBI. But like I said, everything is usually amicable. If you want non-amicable, I suggest you read James Ellroy's novels set in Los Angeles, where you have seems a constant war between the LAPD and the Los Angeles County Sheriff.
And AJ, I know you've been doing some research also on things like you said, like dealing with military bases and pieces like that as well. And Jack, of course, you came from that too. Is there anything we see that would be different? We see things like NCIS and whatnot. Are there major differences in how military police would handle these kinds of investigations versus civilian?
Yes, because the MP are not trained in the same way that a detective would be. They don't really handle murders for the most part. They're handling like domestic disputes and things along those lines. So it's not something they're trained in. They're very aware of this. They don't want to handle it for the most part. If it becomes something like a murder case or an assault case, 9 times out of 10, they're going to reach out to local PD and go, this one's yours, because that's not what they're equipped to handle, and it's not what they're meant to handle. That said, a lot of the conflict that we see on TV just doesn't really exist. I mean, all these different agencies, they want to catch the bad guy. They want this guy off the streets. So they're going to cooperate as much as they can, unless, like I said, we have personality conflicts that are coming into it. But one of the detectives I talked to at one point was often called on to base because his station was right next to a military base. And he handled a lot of different cases of sexual assault, murder, missing cases, just because the MP didn't want to touch it.
Well, that's basically, you're just talking about military bases in the States. We have a lot of military bases outside the States. Sometimes in countries aren't too friendly. If the incident happens on the base, military police, MPI, or, if it's Air Force, OSI, or whatever the Navy is on their 6 different TV shows about their particular agency, does the investigations. But yeah, I mean, it does differ. I know I was in 2 different branches of military. I was a MP in the Army. I was fire protection in the Air Force. I got involved in a murder thing when I was in the Air Force. I basically got in a fight with this guy. We were arguing about something, and they locked him up an hour later. It turns out prior to arguing with me, he killed his mistress. And yeah. I guess it could have gone worse for me on that one. But we had something called chem warfare bag, where you kept the gear that you put on, you know, when there's chemical warfare, the mask, the suit, the whole 9 yards. You got to check the tag once a year. My tag was torn. He was tearing me a new one on it. And I kind of gave it right back to him, and it turned out he just killed his mistress because she was going to tell his wife. The Air Force did the entire investigation because it was in Germany. The Germans weren't involved in it. Basically they taped off his area. They pulled his sink. And the whole thing came about it because he found the body in the woods. He basically, took it out, lit it on fire, didn't have the head in the hands. And I'm like, they're never going to ID her. And they ID'd her in 6 hours. It turned out she had a metal pin with a serial number on it and a collarbone. So, I was way off right off the bat. But yeah, I mean, and they had it wrapped up pretty quick, and that was all Air Force. So it depends on the location.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the overseas guys will have to actually manage themselves, but in state, they don't tend to do it as much. I will say this too, something else that I learned during all this research is military laws are different.
Very.
Like, you would not believe how different. Adultery is still a crime underneath the Naval Code. Like, they will actually put you through a military court for that. So you have to kind of research on that.
Yeah, there are states where adultery is still illegal as well.
Yeah, there are too, but it's not common, and it's not something we think about as authors because, of course, every state law is a little bit different. But yeah, if you're going to be doing anything on a military base, make sure to read up on the codes first, or talk to someone who's in the biz, because they would know best on what you can and cannot prosecute and what would actually put you into cuffs.
So I want to throw one more question out there. Whether it's something in fiction or something just in practice you guys have done, what's one thing we haven't talked about yet tonight that somebody who's talking about the handling of evidence, crime scenes, all the sort of stuff we've talked about? Because, I mean, there's a lot of things we still haven't talked about, like what happens in the aftermath of the crime scene and cleanup and potentially some of those things as well, or what happens in the lab. We kind of joke all the time about, on TV, we see everything as DNA, even if all it was a broken hangnail. But what's one thing that we haven't covered that somebody really does need to think about or know about?
And like you said, Jim, the main thing is TVs, and in some cases, fiction, seems to suggest that once the evidence is recovered, it's bing, bang, boom. The detective has a full report on the DNA, the fingerprints, et cetera, within a couple of days. Can it happen? Yes. If the case is what we would call a major red ball, if it's if it involves the mayor or the president of the city council or something like that, yes, you can get all this done in one day, or at least a couple of days. But generally, it takes a long time for fingerprints to be examined, for DNA to be processed and examined, and sometimes the jurisdiction. If you're trying to do a glass match, the jurisdiction may not have somebody who is certified in matching glass, something like that. So the one thing that fiction, be it on television or in a book, something like that, does not cover is the length of time it takes for analyses.
AJ?
There's two different things that Hollywood is either just kind of glanced or glossed over, or they've given us the wrong impression of. One of them is scent. They never really cover how things smell on a crime scene. Like, a body that's been burned, that smells like bacon. And that's not a detail that you see in books very often. I've unfortunately squeaked out my readers more than once by mentioning stuff like this. But, since it's kind of a powerful factor that you want to put into the sensory details of the scene, because it's going to help the reader understand just what they're experiencing. It's going to draw them further into the scene. So you do want to consider putting in those kind of details. The second thing is they don't really do good cop, bad cop in interviews. That's really a Hollywood invention. You want to get on the good side of the person that you're interviewing because you want them to talk to you. So if you can come in knowing a little bit about their hobbies or, getting a good rapport going with this person and just talk, you're just sitting there having a conversation. Often these guys will not only confess to what you need them to confess to, but they'll add a couple of other things.
Yeah.
Because to them, they're just having a conversation. They're not really remembering the fact that you're a detective at a certain point. So, yeah, the good cop, bad cop is not something you actually want to use in an interview process.
Particularly since everybody is now expecting.
Wayland?
I'll spin it in a slightly different direction. If you're trying to write something really detailed, if you're coming up on a scene that is really particularly nasty, that can shake whoever your responding officer is in your work of fiction. The first fatal car accident I rolled up on, I mean, it was something out of a movie. The flames were like 30 feet high. I was getting hair singed off my arms from, 20 feet away. And as AJ said, the smell is very distinctive. I'd almost say more barbecue than bacon, but it depends on exactly what's burning. And I was probably not operating at the most efficient I ever have for the first half hour after I dealt with all of that. So that is an aspect, and obviously that could affect your being able to collect evidence and process things clearly. So that is an aspect you could potentially toss into your story.
One thing that it's usually covered in fiction and it really exists is copy. Jokes are made on crime scenes that are highly inappropriate anyway. Anywhere else, they are not meant for the general public. It's more a we laugh so we don't cry type of thing. It's a release of tension. And if we weren't being recorded, I could tell you some.
And now that's all on body camera footage.
Yeah, that's generally defensive. They say a person has the potential of having 7 PTSD.
We lost you again, Jack.
All right, sorry. That's basic. Can you hear me now?
Yep, we're good.
All right, that's basically a defense mechanism to protect your mind from the horrors that you're seeing. They said the average person has the potential for 7 PTSD moments in their life. A cop has 77 a year. So the gallows humor is a way of dealing with it. Unfortunately, for the rest of the public, it doesn't look that good.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things we didn't cover was off-the-wall shooting. As a supervisor, I've had to deal with a couple. There's the whole evidence preservation with the officer stuff. TV, they basically, give me a gun, you're on, come back tomorrow, whatever. No, we take the whole gun belt, and we give the officer another gun. The reason we do that is because you take an officer's gun away, he or she thinks, well, maybe I screwed up. Maybe I shouldn't have done the shooting. And, they get inside their own head. We take the whole gun belt because you want to check the rounds in the magazines that are on the belt, things along those lines, especially if the officer was fighting with the person, with their tears on the holster where the bad guy was trying to get the officer's gun, things along those lines. The other thing is we send the officer to the hospital because there's a huge adrenaline dump with the whole flight or fight thing. So you want to get in the hospital. A lot of officers have had heart attacks after being involved in off-the-wall shooting or, a fight where they're rolling around. Sometimes you want the officer's uniform because you have DNA transfer. You've got, bad guy's blood on the officer's uniform, the officer's blood on the bad guy's uniform. Very briefly, a touch on Ferguson. One of the ways that, everyone got all upset when the officer was acquitted because the newspapers weren't reporting that his DNA was in the officer's car. He was in the car. Well, the newspapers didn't report that, but that was a major factor in that case. So you want to check for things like that, especially when it involves the officers. You also keep the officer out of work. He doesn't show up the next day and goes back to investigate crime. He's on administrative leave. He or she's on administrative leave. Counseling is available for them. And they're done. They're definitely not involved in the case at that point, which, a lot of books, a lot of shows. I mean, it makes a good story. Just doesn't happen in real life.
Let me add something onto this, because speaking as a paralegal, this drives me absolutely up the wall. There's no such thing as civilians arrest. A civilian cannot arrest anybody if they do not have the authority to do that. Can they help spot the criminal? Can they report it in? Can they keep eyes on them? Sure. Can they arrest them? No. Just throwing that out there because it drives me crazy.
One thing about what to add on to what Jack was saying, they stopped doing it for a time when there was a police involved shooting. They would automatically give the officer a breath test just to verify that he is not under the influence of alcohol at the time of the shooting. It started when there were a couple officers doing surveillance of a suspect in a bar, and when the suspect left the bar and the officers followed him, there was an exchange of gunfire, and the officers were tested, were given an alcohol test just to verify the fact that they had not been drinking in the bar. So that's something to consider.
Well, guys, I appreciate everybody coming in tonight for one of those lighter topics, when the bodies hit the floor and how we figure out how they got there. But before we get out of here, let's make sure everybody knows where to find you guys. And if you got something new that's out, let's let them know where to find that too. So, Jack?
You always pick me first. I can be found at my website's jackcullenwrites.com. I can be found on Twitter, Instagram, really, on Facebook at Jack Cullen Books. You just add the rest of the stuff to it. And on Amazon.
John?
Okay, my two most current books are Mortal Sins. So a former CSI, former private eye, is now working as a forensic investigator for the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office. And as things go on, he finds out his main antagonist just happens to be the Baltimore City State's Attorney. Hilarity ensues. I also have The Last Monster, the final collection in my Bianca Jones series. Bianca is a Baltimore City police detective who fights monsters, both human and inhuman. You can find me. You can find my books on Amazon. You can find me on Facebook, John French, or my author's page, John L.
AJ?
You can find me on ajsherwood.com. I am almost always on Facebook. I'm never on Insta or Twitter. So Facebook's kind of your best bet. That said, my 5th book in the John's Mystery series should be out fairly soon because I got edits back today that I have to deal with. So they're about 2 months.
Now we know why the blood's on the floor.
Yeah.
Wayland?
I'm on Twitter for now, at least, at Wayland Smith 1. I still want to find who beat me to Wayland Smith on Twitter. If you search me on Facebook and you find an avatar come up that's a German Shepherd head, that's me. I am on Instagram when I remember to post there, which is next door to never. I am very active on Goodreads, and I review all comic book based superhero TV and movie shows on a site called comicbookclog.com. My most recent release is called Old Gods and New Drugs, which is book 2 of my series about superhuman mercenaries.
And I've had the pleasure of being you guys' host tonight, Jim Nettles, and you can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentials.net, authoressentialsworkshops.com, the Speculative Fiction Academy, and of course here at ConTinual. And we will see everybody again soon.